All right. So that is what we're going to be discussing tonight. So what I am going to do is pull up a photo because I actually wrote notes that I'm going to read from. I just have to pull up this little screenshot deal so you guys have something to look at while I'm doing this. 1 second, please. There it is. The only thing that sucks about StreamYard is you have to like maximize everything and then it kind of gets befuddled, are the words I'm looking for. Okay. All right, so you guys can still see me, so we're going to go ahead and start. And then at the end of this, I encourage all of you to kind of join in. I'll drop the link, and anybody who wants to come in and talk about it can. And these two men that we're talking about, Lucky Luciano and Joe Bonanno, historically have some heat. And for those that are leaving comments, I'll get to them as soon as I'm done with this, all right? And there's a lot of reasons why they historically had heat. And there seems to be so much that we can't really prove because there's just so many stories about the hatred between the two of them, that I thought this would be sort of an interesting topic. And you know, it's not about who's right, it's not about who's wrong, or allegations that we can't prove. It's just sort of a topic, okay? And we have to ask a few important questions. Number one, if Luciano didn't like or didn't trust Joe Bonanno, what were those reasons, right? That's number one. And why would then Luciano name him a boss? And then why would Luciano have Joe Bonanno at the Palermo Summit to discuss narcotics trafficking, bringing basically Bonanno into the fold? And so where do you begin with all of this? Well, we have to go back to the Maranzano and Masseria hits, right? We know, without regurgitating the entire history, that Joe Masseria more or less took over the mob in New York City, and early on hired Luciano to be one of his gunmen, basically, okay? The power shift in New York was truly between Masseria and Salvatore D'Aquila, okay? Originally, excuse me, D'Aquila was a part of the Morello crime family, but he would split to form his own family, controlling interests from Harlem to the Bronx, and he would eventually push all the way into Brooklyn and then to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And in those early days, Salvatore was the early impetus of the boss of bosses. And when Salvatore gets hit in 1928, Masseria ends up becoming the head of the Mafia, as it were. And as a result of that, Masseria applies pressure to the rest of organized crime to either kick up or else. And about the same time this is going on, Don Vito Casciofero sends Salvatore Maranzano to Brooklyn to try and forcibly take over the mob. And eventually this would lead to the Castellammarese War. So who was on whose side? And that's kind of important because this is where the beef starts. Well, on the Maranzano side was Joe Bonanno, Vito Bonaventure, Stefano Magaddino, Joe Profaci, Joe Aiello, Tommy Reina, Tommy Gagliano, Tommy Lucchese, and Niccolo Schiro. On the Masseria side of the fence was Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Joe Morello, Al Capone, Manfredi Mineo, Albert Anastasia, Willie Moretti, Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, and Carlo Gambino, kind of the all-stars of the mob, right? So, as we know, both sides would trade shots, and eventually Luciano goes to Maranzano, and he agrees to murder Masseria in return for becoming the number 2 in the organization, and he wants all of the rackets on the other side of the fence, okay? So what ends up happening is Masseria gets hit, and Luciano gets what he asks for. But Maranzano was a lot like Masseria in terms of an old mustache Pete, was kind of a greedy guy and didn't really trust anybody. And Luciano knew that they're simply trading one overbearing asshole for another one, and then begins a coup within the ranks of killing Maranzano. And the problem is that Joe Bonanno allegedly is the one who tips off Maranzano about Luciano's desires. And Maranzano then goes to Joe Adonis about killing Luciano, who in turn tells Tommy Lucchese. And what ends up happening is they both go to Lucky Luciano and they tell him, they're going to kill you. I mean, you're going to die. This is the end. And as we know, Luciano takes out Maranzano as well, and he reforms the mob. And he ends up naming Tommy Gagliano, Joe Profaci, Joe Bonanno, Vincent Mangano, Al Capone, and Stefano Magaddino as bosses of the newly formed Mafia. Now, Joe Bonanno had been a problem during the early days of these discussions because Luciano knew that somebody had tipped off Maranzano. And I believe, and I can't prove it to you, but I believe he suspected Joe Bonanno all along. Joe Profaci had similar issues because he was sort of a stalwart and he refused to pick a side and refused to budge really with anything. And Joe Bonanno was the same way, but Bonanno was sort of behind the scenes playing people off of each other. So the question is why would Luciano then pick Bonanno to become a boss of his own family? Especially when there were suspicions of sort of what he had done. Why give Bonanno any sort of power? And I think the answer to that is a lot more simplified than most of you guys. Sometimes when you think about things, especially in organized crime history, a lot of people have a tendency to overthink. And I don't think this is an overthinking situation. This is a situation where there was a war and guys are going to pick sides. They're going to pick allies. They're going to look out for themselves. And I think Luciano understood that on a certain level. But I also think in many ways, he placated Bonanno by allowing him to become a boss, because by giving Bonanno what he wants, it cools his heels and it leaves Luciano in many ways in charge of Bonanno and what Bonanno can actually do. And it's a more simplified version of keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Luciano was risking nothing but sort of allowing Joe Bonanno's ego to be fed. And I think Luciano knew early on that Bonanno's power base or any desires that he might have are going to be negated by the friendships with Tommy Lucchese, Vito Genovese, and other people. So Bonanno really is no threat to Luciano, and I think that's why he does what he does. Now, 1957 is a year we have to discuss because two huge things take place. The first event that takes place is the Palermo Summit, which took place between October 12th and the 16th of 1957. Luciano had already established the narcotics routes in the Caribbean and had already basically been tossed out of Cuba and sent packing back to Naples by 1954. So the Palermo Summit was a meeting about heroin distribution on an epic scale, including what would become what we know as the French Connection. Luciano would call that meeting, and those in attendance were Joe Bonanno, Carmine Galante, Frank Garofalo, John Bonaventure, Lucky Luciano, Santos Sorge, John DeBella, Salvatore and Angelo LaBarbera, Salvatore Greco, Gaetano Badalamenti, Cesar Manzella, Giacchino Panino, Rosario Mancino, Filippo and Vincenzo Rimi, and future rat Tommaso Buscetta. The who's who of narcotics trafficking, okay? And at this meeting, there were really two objectives. Number one, the heroin trade, right? But also, they wanted the Sicilian mobsters in Italy to form a ruling commission. And they discussed the ruling, sort of the rules, how it would work, and the pros and cons of doing it. And the Sicilian mob prior to that had never, ever done that. They were very clannish. So the results of this meeting basically saw the Sicilian mafia form its first commission ever in history in Italy. And the narcotics trade goes full steam ahead. Ultimately, Luciano wanted control of the narcotics rackets in Europe to New York and beyond. And as Luciano saw it, Sicilians controlling the ebb and flow allowed American bosses not to take any undue risks. Okay, so the Sicilians would do all the legwork, and in return, Sicilians could establish themselves in America as well and sort of be surrogates of the American mob. So after that meeting in November, we know that Apalachin happens, right? And what is so mysterious about that whole entire event is that Joe Bonanno was a no-show, but his driver's license was surreptitiously found in a car. So it begs us to ask a question here. If Luciano didn't trust Bonanno from day one, right? Why on earth make him a boss? Why on earth put him in Palermo, which was immediately surveilled by the Italian authorities and the American authorities? They watched the whole thing. They saw who was coming and going. So why trust anything he does? And you have to keep in mind, this is prior to Joe Bonanno heading back to Montreal and establishing rackets there, putting Carmine Galante in place to absorb everything. And so there's a whole bunch of moving pieces here. But like I always say, I'm not 100% certain, but I think there are a few things that do make sense and some others that don't. And so I'm going to give you my thoughts, but I want all of you to sort of put on your mafia thinking caps for a second and help me figure this out. Number one, Luciano didn't trust Bonanno at all, right? And I've often thought that Luciano had the mindset that Bonanno being closer than further away was probably a smarter move. Hence, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, sort of a thing. And I think Luciano also knew that Bonanno, other than cozying up to Joe Profaci, could never really establish a base to overthrow him in any kind of way. And you can go, years further in the paranoia that Bonanno would have about Lucchese and Gambino and the reason why he goes and get Joe Magliacco to kill everybody. So we know from a sort of a character aspect, Bonanno was a sort of a wily guy in some sense. He was worried about a lot of other people's power bases, right? So I think Luciano gives Bonanno his own family to keep a closer watch on him, sort of an olive branch. Maybe if I give him this, he'll stop his nonsense. So then you have the summit, right? The Palermo narcotics distribution meetings. Why take him or request him to go to Canada instead of, say, somebody else? Why pick him of all people? And this is where things sort of get murky for me. For starters, I know that Luciano wanted to completely control the narcotics markets. And using somebody like Joe Bonanno could be a dangerous thing to do, considering that he knew Joe Bonanno wanted everything. But Luciano needed somebody he could bend, or at least somebody he thought he could bend and manipulate. And ultimately, Luciano believed that he was going to get back into the United States at some point. And I think this was his way of risking a lot to ensure that he kept a hand on the power in the mob. Okay, because basically Apalachin was the ascension of Vito Genovese as the boss of bosses, and Luciano's done and this, that, and the third. So on the back end of it, this is how Luciano can still control organized crime from Italy. He knows that Joe Bonanno is going to want to expand. And what he's risking is Joe getting a big head. That's the only risk. And essentially he's thrusting a guy who wants everything into a situation where he can certainly attain all of that given certain parameters. And I think this was simply an act of placating Bonanno to do the legwork in Canada. And at some point, I think Luciano would have cut the head off the snake and take over everything again. I just don't see the reason for Luciano wanting to be so giving to a guy he could not trust, considering everything that was at stake. And I just think that Luciano had designs on remaining in power, and the way of doing that was through narcotics. But what do you guys think? I mean, why put Bonanno in that position? And I also think Bonanno behind the scenes tried to placate Luciano. It's a war of attrition between two gangsters. Bonanno was in a better vantage point. And I think he was using Luciano himself. And I can see Bonanno placating Luciano long enough just to attain the power he needed, only to turn on Luciano in the end, because Bonanno was able to be in the United States. Luciano wasn't. I also think because Bonanno had deep inroads into heavily Sicilian contacts, there was probably a lot of backstabbing going on after that meeting, or prior, or before, or months down the road, because Bonanno wasn't a stupid guy. And so this is Luciano's last stand, the last chance for Bonanno to get what he wants, and that was power. With narcotics and Carmine Galante, Bonanno could have easily pushed the commission around just because of the sheer amount of money that's involved. Money controls everything. And I don't know, given if that worked out, how long Bonanno would have stood tall. But it's an interesting viewpoint, to say the least. So the question that will arise about Apalachin and who dropped a dime on that meeting, and we've talked about it 100 times before, but really Bonanno, thinking about his desires and his designs, really becomes the prime suspect for somebody who would have dropped a dime. However, because I'm always transparent at the same time, doesn't it almost always make sense as well? Doesn't it make Luciano a suspect too? And it does, because Genovese had a problem with Costello and Luciano. And I would love to tell you that Lucky Luciano would never, ever do that in a million years. But also keep in mind, this is a guy who wants back into the United States, and he still wants to control everything in the mob. It would benefit Bonanno and Luciano both, believe it or not. It would benefit them both to drop fucking dimes on Apalachin, because if the commission gets all hemmed up, their power gets deflated. And it makes sense on a street level, but like I said, I can't be certain about it either way. But the mere fact that Joe Bonanno was weirdly absent from that event, and the fact that he had talked to the feds as well as his son talking to the feds, I mean, it sort of becomes a guessing game at this point. And you always have to ask yourself, which one of these gentlemen, who would it benefit more in the long run? And I don't think that Luciano benefits from that, because he's still stuck out of the country. He's never getting back in. The only way he's coming back is in a coffin, and that's how it went down. And Bonanno benefits more than anybody. But it's a crapshoot. It's a total crapshoot. And so that's basically where I stand with it. I'm not really sure. Now I'm going to have to go back up in the chat. Um, I'm going to drop the link if anybody does want to talk about this because I really don't know what the exact